Welcome everyone to Pathways Through the Orchard. This week is Parshat Vayeishev, and we're going to start right from the beginning. I hope to share three different insights on this parsha. So, right at the beginning of the parsha, the second verse says, Eila toldot Yaakov Yosef ben 17 shana haya ro'eh et echav betzon v'hu na'ar et b'nei bilha ve'et b'nei zilpa shnei nashei aviv v'yaveh Yosef et dibatam ra'ah el avihim. So I will translate. These are the generations of Yaakov. Now we might expect for the Torah to list all of his children, but only Yosef is mentioned. These are the generations of Yaakov, Yosef, who was 17 years old, and he was a shepherd along with his brothers of the sheep, and he would, and there's many different interpretations of the V'hu na'ar et b'nei bilha. You could read it, and he was a youngster. He was the young, at that point, he was the youngest of all of the sons. But some say that it was, he took care of the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, the two of the wives of Yaakov. But Yosef would bring like evil reports to his father. That's how the parsha begins. So there's a lot of questions here. I want to focus on one idea and expand it, in a sense, to the entire Tanakh. Here, in Masechet Shabbat 10b, if anyone wants to see, the sages criticize Yaakov. They criticize him for showing favoritism. And they point out that because he showed favoritism to him, in another sentence, which we didn't get to, it says that he loved Yosef, and he made him what we refer to the famous coat of many colors, as to distinguish his favoritism towards Yosef. So the sages criticize this. It's like, Yaakov, for showing favoritism, look what you got in motion here. And so here we see the sages criticizing Yaakov. One of the explanations of that he was a youth, it implies Yosef's somewhat immaturity. Because what happens right after this? He has a dream. And in the dream, which we're going to get back to later in the class, he dreams of sheaves, they're binding sheaves of grain, and his stands up, and all the other sheaves go around him and bow down to him. So here again, the sages question, Yosef, what were you thinking? It already says that the brothers could not speak peacefully to him because their father had showed favoritism, and they were jealous. So why did you tell him this dream? What did you think you were accomplishing? And then there's another question. Why did Yaakov favor Yosef? And then there's the question, why, if Yosef was the youngest of them, why couldn't they have just thought, okay, he's a little bit immature, he's having dreams of grandeur, he'll grow up. So the point I want to make here is that it seems that just in the first few verses of this parsha, there are not only a lot of questions, but the sages and later commentaries have criticism for Yaakov, for Yosef, for the brothers. And so we ask, well, what is happening here? Is this the only time that we see a text that is ripe for questions and criticism? And the answer, of course, is no. And this is the point that I want to focus in on. It's a very, very important general principle of understanding the Torah. The Torah is a holy book. When we think of a holy book, we might think that it should be full of beautiful, philosophical, spiritual, mystical, clear teachings. That's a holy book. The Torah is obviously very different. It spells out almost nothing, except for a handful of mitzvot. No reasons are given for any of the mitzvot. That's in the written Torah. Of course, the oral Torah, that's what we always say. Without the oral Torah, we simply cannot understand the written Torah. The written Torah is not understandable without the oral Torah. But still, we see as a holy book, it really is very, very different in that there are all kinds of incidences of war, jealousy, murder, incest, brothers selling their brother, you name it. It has everything, rape, everything. So what we need to understand is the Torah is not necessarily advocating the behavior of many of the people in the Torah. In other words, if the sages come and criticize Yaakov for showing favoritism, you could say, well, the Torah says that he showed favoritism, so it must be okay. But that's not how we understand the Torah. The Torah is, along with being a very spiritual, mystical book, a book of instruction of how to live, it's also dealing with the realities of the world. And it doesn't necessarily advocate what some of the stories are showing. And some of the times that's quite obvious. But other times, it's not so obvious. I'll just give one example that pops into my head. In the sixth day of creation, when God creates man, so it says that man should rule over the animals and should rule over the earth. So I've seen it that many people who don't understand what this means criticize the Torah for a lack of sensibility about the environment. In other words, doesn't the Torah say we're supposed to rule over the world? We're supposed to rule over the animals and nature? But that's not what the Torah is saying. The Torah is simply saying we have to understand there was a time, and actually it still exists in certain places, where wild animals used to eat people, used to attack villages. This is no electricity, no technology, where we were at the whims of nature. Anyone who lives in a hurricane zone, and I'm looking at Amy right here, knows the dangers of nature, or in an earthquake zone, or in a flood zone. So the Torah is simply saying not to destroy the world, just the opposite, but to learn to rule over nature in a way that's beneficial to everyone. So here's just an example that someone could say, oh, the Torah is advocating we just run over nature and not pay attention to it. It's quite the opposite. So having said that, and we mentioned right here in the beginning, so what I'd like to do is, and this is a far from complete list, but I just want to point out many of the greatest people in Jewish tradition where the sages of the commentaries will criticize them for certain things. Now, before we do that, though, and I'm just going to give an example, that this week I had a very long back and forth over email, and I'm not saying anything negative here, about someone who was very disturbed by the possibility that King Solomon did anything wrong in his life. It was like, it can't be. The Torah describes him as the wisest person who ever lived. How could we even think that he did anything wrong? Well, it turns out that it didn't have to wait for the sages or the commentaries. In the book of Kings itself, it says at the end of his life, Shlomo, what we would call, went off the derech. He was influenced by his foreign wives, and he did many things that he shouldn't have done. That's in the book of Kings itself. So we have to say something here, is when the sages understood and appreciated and were in awe of Avram, Yitzhak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, and David HaMelech, and Eliyahu Navi, and Shlomo HaMelech, Yosef, the tribes. These are our spiritual giants, but the Torah never claims that they were perfect. They're human beings, and they made choices, and some of the choices were not always the best choices. And so it's very important to understand when the sages criticized, in a sense, when they point out that they felt that they did something not even wrong, something we could learn from, it doesn't diminish their greatness. This is a very important thing, especially today in the way that the media works, that someone could be super popular, super famous, super righteous, and in one interview they say like one thing that they probably shouldn't have said. But the way it works now, within minutes, it's broadcast all over the world, and people have very short memories. And it's like, okay, forget this person. They said this one thing, and everything else that they accomplished, everything they did, we're just going to forget about it. That's not how we look at people in general, and especially the greats, the spiritual giants that are part and parcel of the Torah. So having said that, I'm just going to point out a number of cases where we see that there is some sort of criticism. Now, anytime there's criticism, there's always a different side of the story. So the first one I'm going to give an example of is because we're talking about Yaakov. In Parshat Vayeishev, Rachel, who sees her sister having child after child, and she has no children, she desperately wants children. She comes to Yaakov and says, if you don't give me children, I'm as good as dead. And it says that Yaakov got angry at her and said, am I instead of God that I'm preventing you from having children? So this a typical argument, perhaps, between a couple, but there's a midrash that, in a sense, quotes God, and God says to Yaakov, "Is this any way to talk to your wife, who is suffering because she doesn't have children?" So the midrash, in a sense, brings God into the equation, and God criticizes Yaakov. The Ramban also, the Ramban says that he was astounded that Yaakov could answer her in this way. Didn't he see how much pain she was in? So here's an example. Now, there's always another side. Some say that his anger, we'll call it a feigned anger, and that we can imagine this was not the first time that Rachel and Yaakov discussed the fact that they didn't have children. It's only this time that the Torah talks about it. And so Yaakov needed to get the point across to her is, I'm not in charge here. I'm not preventing you from having children. You need to turn to God and pray. Others criticize Yaakov. Why didn't he pray? Why didn't the Torah tell us that he prayed? Yitzchak prayed when Rivka and Yitzchak didn't have children, and the Torah spells that out. Why didn't Yaakov? And so, again, in the positive sense, some say that his anger was to shake her into the realization that she was directing her angst in the wrong place. It needed to be directed to God. And of course, eventually God did answer Rachel's prayers. So that's just an example. What about Avram? Many of you have the book I just wrote. One was Avram, the most influential person who ever lived. How could we even think of saying anything less than perfect for Avram? But there are many, many commentaries who question Avram when he went down to Egypt with Sarah. And he says, "Tell them that you're my sister, and that will protect me." And so the commentaries ask, but what about Sarah? How is she protected? Okay, there are deep spiritual explanations for this as well. Anytime that we're going to quote a question or a criticism, there are other explanations. But Avram did it twice about calling Sarah his sister. And in both times, Sarah was put in a very compromised position. So they ask, was this the best strategy for Avram to adopt? Then we come to Moshe. This is Moshe Rabbeinu, brings down the Torah from heaven. What could we even imagine of the spiritual level that Moshe was on? But the Torah itself, when he hit the rock, instead of speaking to it, so that, as you can imagine, there's so much commentary, especially when God said, because you did this, you and Aaron cannot come into Eretz Yisrael. And so everyone asked, okay, he hit the rock instead of talking to it, but is that a reason not to let him come into Eretz Yisrael? After 40 years of, total mesirat nefesh, total selflessness. But in the text, it says that he got angry at the people. And in fact, in I believe it's in Fruits of the Orchard, or maybe it's in Orchard of Delights, I write about this whole idea of the negative results of anger. And so here, even Moshe Rabbeinu, who leads Am Yisrael through thick and thin, he also is a human being, and he got angry. At one point, many people, because it's so hard to understand, at one point, Moshe says to God, if you don't send me help, you might as well just kill me. It's just like, I can't handle this anymore. And it's in the text. It's not like a midrash. So here we see Moshe is a human being. If you can imagine the test that Moshe had 24/7 for 40 years, are we surprised that every once in a while he would lose his cool? He's a human being. But we see that he paid for his anger. There are many other commentaries of what exactly went wrong with his hitting the rock. But I'm just saying this is one of the explanations. Is Moshe, you paid a very high price for your anger. And he talked down on the people. He accused them of being rebels. And by his hitting the rock, he was hitting it somewhat in resentment, in anger. So even Moshe Rabbeinu is called upon to explain his actions. Another thing about Moshe Rabbeinu that the Talmud discusses in great detail was his insistence on bringing the mixed multitude out of Egypt. And the Midrash says clearly that God says to him, don't take them. I know you think that they're ready, but they're not ready yet. They're on their way, but they're not ready yet. And Moshe insisted on taking them. And we know that they caused lots of problems in the desert. Now, the Zohar says about Moshe Rabbeinu, says that the neshama of Moshe is present in every generation. And call it the simple understanding is we have this concept that call it a part of Moshe, a spark of Moshe is manifest in the leaders of each generation. But the other explanation is, and that's a tremendous merit to Moshe, that his soul returns to help Am Yisrael. Moshe gave his whole life for Am Yisrael. And not only when he was alive, that there's a spark of Moshe that reincarnates in every generation and will be manifest in the leaders of the generation. But then there's another side to it, is that because he brought the Erev Rav, which caused so many problems in the desert, Moshe's soul has to come back in every generation to fix that. So here we have like both sides of the equation. But nonetheless, there is a side that Moshe really miscalculated here. And it had profound effect. And this is the great Moshe Rabbeinu. But again, he's not an angel. He's not perfect. And so it's pointed out in different traditions that he also has what to fix. Now, there's a similar thing with Eliyahu Navi, Elijah the prophet. Elijah the prophet lived at a time when Achav and Isabel are literally killing all of the prophets. They introduced the Baal, foreign god, and they are relentless in their pursuit of killing off all the prophets. Elijah has to flee to the Sinai desert. And when he's there, it's all in the book of Malachim, God says to him, Eliyahu, what are you doing here? And Eliyahu says, they're killing all the prophets. I'm the only one left. And your whole people have abrogated the covenant with you. And then God appears to him, and Eliyahu goes back. But when we think of Eliyahu Navi, like we think of, like, he actually, according to tradition, literally turned into an angel. When he ascended to heaven in a fiery chariot, we're told that his soul was transmuted into an angel. And that's why he can come back in different guises, like an angel, throughout the generations. So we have the tradition, of course, that Eliyahu comes to every Pesach Seder, and he comes to every circumcision, every Brit. So we have a special chair for Eliyahu Navi at a circumcision. We pour a special cup of wine for Eliyahu at the Seder. So this sounds like, wow, which is true. But there's another explanation of why he comes to every circumcision. Because he said to God, your entire people have abrogated your covenant. So the oral tradition says, God says to Eliyahu, you think that's true? Do you really think that everyone has abrogated the covenant for all generations? I will show you. You will have to come to every Brit, every circumcision in every generation to see that the Jewish people have not abrogated the Brit. So I could go on and on with many, many other people. But again, the most important thing I'm trying to give over here is that the greatest of the great are not perfect. They're not infallible. And they do make mistakes. And our sages in the oral tradition have no problem pointing it out. But at the same time, they, in my mind, it adds to the reverence and the awe that we should have. Here are human beings that reached such levels of godliness and purity and holiness, and despite being human and having emotions and having their moments, they're still the greatest of the great. Okay, l'chaim, everyone, l'chaim. Okay, now we're going to move to a different part of the Parsha. And here, again, as I explained before, I've dealt with this issue before in Orchard of Delights at great length, but I want to point out something new. And this is the incident between Yehudah and Tamar. Yehudah, after the selling of Yosef, the brothers blamed him because he was the one who said, we shouldn't kill him, we should sell him. And Yehudah was the leader. And in a sense, once they realized what they had done, they, of course, did tshuva. But Yosef is gone. He's sold into slavery. So Yehudah goes off by himself. He marries. He has 3 sons. The first son married Tamar. He died. The second son, in a Levirate marriage, also marries Tamar. He dies. And now Yehudah is very reluctant to give his 3rd son. According to tradition, Tamar was a very, very holy person, and she had a clear prophecy that she was meant to have children from the family of Yehudah, and that they would be kings. They would be also spiritual giants. So here she is thinking, Yehudah is never going to give me the younger son. And so the whole story is she dresses up like a prostitute. Yehudah's with her. And 3 months later, they realize that she's pregnant, and Yehudah wants to punish her, actually to kill her, execute her. And then she, because he left with her his signet and his staff, and so right before he's going to execute her, she says, the person who the signet and the staff is, that's who I'm pregnant by. And only then does Yehudah realize that it's him. Now, Yehudah could have faked that he didn't know what she's talking about, and this guy gotten rid of her as quickly as possible. But he said, in the text, it says, Sadka mimeni, she is more righteous than me. In other words, I admit, I didn't know that it was from me, and I'm not going to hide it. Sadka mimeni, she is more righteous than me. So Rashi, in a very, very important statement, says that the simple understanding is, he said, she's right, I'm wrong. And the Rashi says something different, though. Along with that, says you can divide the words in two. Yehudah said, Tzadka, she is righteous. And a voice came from heaven and said, Mimeni, this whole thing is from me. God is speaking. This whole incident I engineered. Now, obvious, this needs a lot of discussion as to what is going on here. And especially, where is the line between free will and God's omnipotence, his providence, and determinism? Because God is saying, I engineered this whole thing. In fact, the Midrash says Yehudah was just walking by Tamar, and God sent an angel to awaken his passion. He was just walking by. He didn't even notice. In other words, the whole thing was a setup. Why? Because according to tradition, she had twins, Zerach and Peretz. From Peretz comes David HaMelech. And from David HaMelech comes the Mashiach. So Tamar's prophecy was clear. She understood that she had to give birth from the family of Yehudah. And since it seemed like Yehudah was the only one left, in order to do this, she did what she did. So the question here is a huge question of many, many stories in the Tanakh and many of our own experiences during life. In other words, when is it that the way things play out in our lives is because of the choices that we make? And when is it when it's me many? when we think that we are making choices, but there's some higher power here that's directing our fate or destiny. And this happens to everyone. There are different junctions in life where we have to make choices, we make choices, and then sometimes a day later, a month later, a year later, 20 years later, we look back and it hits us like, I can't believe how God was leading me in a certain way. I thought I was making all these decisions, and I was, but there was another force, another hand here. So there's a verse that we say every day in the morning prayers in Shachri. It says, Rabot machshavot belev ish, va'atzat Hashem hi takum. Many are the thoughts in the heart of a person, and the advice or the direction of God, that is what will be established. So we'll call it the simple way of understanding this is a person can have all kinds of thoughts. Like we have the expression, it comes from the original Yiddish, man plans and God laughs. In other words, we plan, but in the end, it's going to be the way that God wants it to be. And that's a simple understanding. Many are the thoughts in the heart of a person, but ultimately, it's God's, Eitzah literally means advice, God's direction that will be established. But there's a different way of reading this. And this is one of the deepest understandings of trying to grapple with the paradox of how can we have true free will, not just the illusion of free will, but true free will. And we also hold that God knows the future, and God is running the world, and God's providence is everywhere. How do we understand how both of these things happen simultaneously? So the different way of reading this is like this. Many are the thoughts in the heart of a person, but we'll take it even further. Many are the deeds in the life of a person, but God will rearrange whatever we decide in a way that fits into each and every person's personal, we'll call it fate or destiny, and the entire world's at the same time. I think I mentioned this last week. They're getting ready to launch these quantum computers, AI computers that can deal with, and this, I read this, quadrillions of actions per second simultaneously. It's mind-boggling. But let's multiply that by a quadrillion times. In other words, every thought, every speech, and every action is fed into, we'll call it the big computer in the sky. But there is a operating system. From the beginning of creation, there's an operating system, and it's all going in a certain direction, even though many times we can't see it. It's difficult for us to see it. The same thing with our own lives. So whatever we will decide, because we do have true free will. whatever we decide instantaneously, God will arrange that this thing will fit into the overall destiny of a person and the destiny of the entire world. And I'm going to use it right now to deal with the situation that we have in Israel. Everyone knows what happened on October 7th. Horrific, horrific. The question is, how do we deal with that? Many people might say, well, how did God allow this? Where was God? Or other people might say that because of certain actions, God allowed this to happen as a measure for measure. But there's a different way of seeing it, according to the verse that we just understood, that when God gave human beings free will, it wasn't just to good people. God gave free will to evil people also. And so when we ask, why do bad things happen to good people? Well, it's because this is the way God set up the world, that not only good people are allowed to make choices. Hamas had their plans. Hamas have their Hebrew, their tachnit, their strategy. They have what they want to accomplish, and we need to deal with it. But there's also, in every bad situation, it can be turned around. Everything can be turned around. And so my belief is what we are seeing now is Atzat Hashem hi takum. In other words, what happened, happened. You could say also, after the Holocaust, 3 years later, we have the state of Israel. The Nazis certainly knew what they wanted to accomplish, but they didn't. And somehow that energy, the most evil of evil of evil of evil, somehow turned around and led to the rebirth of the state of Israel. So I believe the same thing is happening now. Many are the thoughts in the heart of a person. We'll say, many are the thoughts and deeds that Hamas just did. But ultimately, Atzat Hashem hi takum. And that's where we come in. We now have to take a very difficult situation, something we didn't ask for, we didn't want, but we now have to make good to come from it. And I personally see, along with the suffering, the pain, the trauma, I see many good things happening all around the Jewish world. And that's what we need to do now. And I believe that God is going to help us bring new things, new perspectives, new ways of seeing things, despite it all, into the world. Okay. With the few minutes that we have left, to be honest, I had a whole other section here, but I want to take this now and apply it, what we've just said, to the question that everyone asks. how could it be that the sons of Yaakov, who we consider to be holy souls, we all come from them, how could they have sold their brother? How did this happen? So we have really a very, very similar thing here. First of all, we're going to say to the, I guess we'll say to the merit of the brothers. It wasn't that they were just jealous and they were petty and they just hated Yosef and they all of this. They thought that Yosef was a true danger to the unity of the family of Israel, who they already knew was going to be the nation of Israel. They were living their lives that they knew that they were archetypal souls who were the seed embryo of the nation of Israel. And when Yosef starts saying, basically, I'm going to be the leader, you are all going to bow to me. And even his second dream, which he shared with his father, where he said, I dreamt of 11 stars and the sun and the moon, and they all bowed down to me. Yosef went as far as to imply that Yaakov himself would bow down to Yosef. The brothers felt this is a danger to the nation of Israel that's about to be formed. But of course, it goes much deeper than that. They were human beings and they were jealous, and they did have a fault of falling into what's called sinat chinam, into hatred for really no reason. Like I said before, they could have just simply said, oh, he's so immature. Like, grow up, Yosef. Like, get on with your dreams. Like, come on. But they took it seriously because of the favoritism that Yaakov had shown, and they felt they were doing right. Now, there's a whole other layer here that Yaakov knew from the prophecy of Brit Ben Abitarim, the covenant of the pieces, that they were meant to go into slavery and to leave Israel. It was prophesied to Avram. Avram gave it over to Yitzhak and Yaakov. And Yaakov is now feeling something is about to happen. And so there's this huge question for thousands of years. When Yaakov sent Yosef to check on his brothers, did he know that he was setting in motion all of their going down to Egypt? Or did he not know? And you have commentaries going back and forth, back and forth. Some say that he actually understood that someone is going to have to start the process. The Midrash says that, it's actually brought out in Chassidut, that Yosef also understood, and he volunteered. In other words, he became you could call it the scapegoat, but he almost chose, let me be the first to go down, instead of my father going down in chains. Let me go down first. Now, this is, again, there's a lot of discussion, and there's so many different ways to see this. But I want to go back to the one point I made about Yehudah and Tamar. When God says, me many, this whole thing is from me. So when we deal with the selling of Yosef, so there's also commentaries that are pointing to the idea is that this was inevitable, but it wasn't inevitable that it had to be through the selling of Yosef. And that's where free choice comes in. In other words, as much as we want to say me many, God saying it came from me, in the end, the brothers made choices. They did have free will. And the same plan of Am Yisrael going down to Egypt and eventually being enslaved and then coming back out, which is exactly the prophecy that God revealed to Avram. It could have happened in a million ways, a quadrillion ways. It didn't have to happen this way. So again, we'll apply Rabot Machshavot Belev Ish. The brothers decided, okay, we won't kill him. We'll sell him. We'll get rid of him. And then there'll be unity in Am Yisrael, and we will go on to great glory. Of course, they all eventually realized the huge mistake that they had made. But in the moment, they at least felt that they were deciding here, and they did. They had free will, and it didn't have to happen this way. But then we applied the second part, the Atzat Hashem Hitakum, that God's plan will be established. It could happen this way, it could happen that way. The brothers sold Yosef, so God was like, okay, I'll make it work this way. This will be the way that it will work. And it did. Yosef ends up being the second most powerful person in Egypt, saves the world from famine, including his family. And his whole family was able to come down in a peaceful way. Yes, eventually they became slaves, and eventually they came out. So this goes back to the bigger picture when God revealed to Avram, this is what's going to happen. So then the question is, was there any way to avoid this? Was there any way to avoid it? And the answer is yes. Because that, God said, for 4 generations, you will go down and be out of Israel, and you will be oppressed. But did it have to be in that particular way? No. And in fact, it was predicted that it would be for 400 years. In the end, we were only in Egypt 210 years. So it didn't exactly happen. No prophecy is written in stone. No prophecy is written in stone. In fact, almost all the prophecies were, if you change your ways, none of this has to happen. None of it has to happen. So these admittedly are very, very profound ideas. They take a lot of thought. And also we have to apply it to our own lives. We have free will. We make choices. We do our best. But at the same time, we're always looking for God's direction. And then sometimes at major junctures in our life, we make certain choices, we go in a certain direction, and then many times it becomes clear to us that I thought it was all my choice. I see how God was leading me the whole time, how God was saving me the whole time. And especially when sometimes we make not such good decisions, which could lead to horrible results, and they don't. And then sometimes we're so aware, like, wow, was God looking out for me? Like I made such poor choices here, which could have led to disaster, but they didn't. And it can lead us to great gratitude for what we do have. Okay, so as I said, these are very profound ideas that need a lot of thought. I bless everyone to grapple with them, because it's not just stories we're reading about in the Torah. It's really like to understand our own lives, to understand how does it work, free will and God's providence. Where is the line? How do they merge? Where's the gray area? And so these are things that are quite relevant to our lives. I bless all of us with clarity, with foresight, and with a lot of faith that even the worst situations can be turned around. And just like many are the thoughts in the heart of a person, but God's direction, God's plan, ultimately, that is what will be established. And I believe very, very strongly that is what's happening in Israel now and in the world. A certain plan is being fulfilled. You can just read it in all of the prophets. All the prophecies are coming true. And we have 1 foot in redemption already, and 1 foot is just dragging behind. We're trying to get it in both feet into redemptive mode. But there is a plan unfolding. It's very clear, very, very clear. And may we see full redemption of the world quickly in our day.